Amazon S3 versioning is a powerful feature that allows you to preserve, retrieve, and restore every version of every object in a bucket. It's crucial for protecting against accidental deletions, maintaining audit trails, and implementing robust data retention strategies. In this video, let's learn how to get started using Amazon S3 versioning and also use it from a .NET application. We will first explore using a create, read, update, and delete API over an Amazon S3 storage without versioning, and then we will see by enabling versioning and see some of these advantages that it gives you when building these APIs. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud, and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my .NET on AWS series. Without much delay, let's get straight into learning more about Amazon S3 versioning. Here in JetBrains Rider, I have an existing ASP.NET API application. This has the program.cs where I have already added a couple of API endpoints. So you can see here I have already injected in an Amazon S3 client using the built-in dependency injection container. So I've added the NuGet package for this and also registered this interface. Now I can start using this inside my controller endpoints. So here we have a get, post, and a delete endpoint already defined with some code. All this is doing is using the S3 client and using it to create, update, and delete objects inside an S3 bucket. The bucket that I'll be using is inside my account, which is my app data files. So in the get method, it's using the get object async method to get the file back and return it over the HTTP API endpoint. We are also using the upload file endpoint to upload a new file and the delete to delete that file. So let's see this in action and see how it's creating the files inside my S3 bucket. So let's run this. And while it opens the Swagger UI, let's switch over to S3 in my AWS console, navigate to buckets and to my app data files. So right now this is empty and this is turned off for versioning. So if I switch into properties, I can see that bucket versioning is disabled. And let's navigate to the Swagger UI and let's upload our first file. So let's go into the post endpoint. Let's say try it out and let's say choose file. So in this case, I'm going to simply upload a sample.json. So let me open this in VS Code so that we can see the contents of this file. Now this is a simple JSON object which has these properties. So let's select this file and upload this to S3. So this is going to upload the file and return back OK. So if I switch over to my app data files and refresh here, I can see the sample.json. Now I could go into this and download this file from the S3 console, but let's go back to our API and use that. So if I go to the get files, let's say try it out, and let's specify the key as sample.json and say execute. Now this is going to download the file. So you can see here we have the file downloaded. So let's click this to download it to our machine. So now this has the sample1.json because I already have that file. And you can see that this has downloaded this file as we have written it into the S3 bucket. Now if I switch over to our Swagger UI and delete this file is going to get removed from S3. So let's say try it out again and let's specify sample.json and click execute. Now if I switch back to S3 and refresh, that file no longer exists in our account. Now without S3 versioning turned on, once you delete a file, it is gone forever. The same applies if you overwrite an existing file. So if I come back to our Swagger UI and choose upload file and select the same file again, so let's say choose file and select our sample.json and execute this, this is going to upload the file which has this file again in our S3 bucket. Now if I come back and upload this same file after making changes, so let's switch over to Visual Studio Code, let's go to the sample.json and say world updated and let's save this. And let's upload the same file again, which is into the same key. As soon as Amazon S3 says the exact same key, it is going to overwrite that existing file. So now if I switch back and refresh, you can see there's still only one file inside our account. This is because that file was overwritten because it had the same key. So if I switch over to the get file and say execute request on sample.json, let's download this file. And you can see here, this is the updated file. So if I switch into S3, you can still see that there's only one file for our sample.json. So the previous file that we already had uploaded is now overwritten. Now, in cases where you need to retrieve this file or revert back into a previous version, you cannot do that without versioning turned on, because any files with the same keys is overwritten or permanently deleted once you remove it from the bucket. So let's see how we can turn on versioning and how to get advantage of this feature by default. So let's switch over to properties to turn on versioning for an existing bucket. Now, if you're creating a completely new bucket inside our Amazon S3 account, you can also choose that as you create this bucket. So if you scroll down in the create bucket screen, you can see that there is an option to turn on versioning. Now, since I already have the bucket created, I can navigate into that and go to properties and say edit on bucket versioning and turn it on. So let's say enable and click save changes. Now, this is going to take some time depending on how many objects you already have in the S3 bucket and also on other factors. So it's recommended to wait for 10 to 15 minutes for versioning to be applicable across your bucket. Versioning in Amazon S3 is a means of keeping multiple variants of an object in the same bucket. Now, this helps to preserve, retrieve, and restore every version of every object. You can recover more easily from both unintended user actions and also application failures. Now, once you enable versioning on an existing bucket, no change happens to the existing objects. Only new objects or the existing objects that gets changed after that will get applied the versioning attributes. Now, a bucket can be in one of these three states. One is the unversioned, which we already saw, which is the default as well. Now, once from that, you can change into version enabled, or you can also move into version suspended. However, note that once you have enabled versioning, you cannot go back to the unversioned status. You'll have to delete that bucket and recreate again. Now, whenever you enable versioning on a bucket, all new objects are versioned and given a unique version ID. Now, if it's not versioned, it will have a version ID of null. If we switch back to our My App data files and go to Objects, so let's navigate here and go to Versions tab, and we can see that the current version ID is null because this was an existing object inside the bucket before we turned the versioning on. Now, if we go back to our Swagger UI and upload a new file, so let's go to the post endpoint and let's say upload file. Let's choose the same file again, which is sample.json, and let's execute this. Now, this is going to upload that file into our S3 bucket, and if I refresh this page, you can see there is a new version that is getting created. We also have the null version, which was the one that was created before versioning turned on, also existing in this table. So now we have two versions of the exact same object inside Amazon S3. So if I go to My App data files and refresh this, here you can still see that there's only one file. So the files are maintained beneath this versioning. So you can also turn on versioning if you want by enabling this toggle bar, and it will start showing all the versions of the object inside this UI itself. Let's switch over to Visual Studio Code and let's update this sample JSON again. So let's say world updated again, and let's upload this file again. So let's go to the post endpoint and let's say try it out, and let's choose the file again. So sample.json and execute this. Now this is going to upload the file again into S3. Now if I switch over to Amazon S3 and refresh this page, you can see we have a third version inside S3 bucket. Now if I go back to Swagger and get the latest version of this file by using the sample.json, so let's say execute, this is going to download this file, and if I open this, this will be the world updated again. So we have the latest file getting retrieved. Now, how do I get the explicit version from this Amazon S3? Now, if we switch over to JetBrains Rider in our application code, you can see that the get file endpoint is simply passing in the bucket name and the key of the file. Now, if we need to get a specific version, we also have to pass in the version ID. So let's update this code to take in a version ID as well. So once we have the string key, let's also pass in a version ID. Now this is an optional value, so let's make this as a string optional value, and let's make this as version ID. Now you can do the same when you're deleting a file as well. So now in this case, we're just taking the file name, but optionally we can also take a string version ID in this case. Now how do we use this? So in the delete object async, we will need to use the version ID along with the file name. So instead of using the simple overloaded function, we will have to pass a new delete object request. Now in this case, we can pass in a few properties, which is going to be the bucket name, the key name, which is going to be key. So we can use the file name in this case. And also we need to pass in the version ID property. So we can pass in the version ID, which we are now getting through our application endpoint. So let's remove this line and let's make sure that we call this object request. Now, this is explicitly passing in a version ID. Now, in cases where this is null, this is going to look at the latest version. So similarly, for our get file, we can get specific versions. So let's pass in the key and the specific version. So let's remove these two and let's use the new get object request overload. So once we have that, let's pass in similarly the bucket name, which is going to be the bucket name, the key, which is going to be the key in this case, and also the specific version ID that we need to return. So let's pass in the version ID and we're going to explicitly get that specific version. Now, as before, if the version ID is null, it's going to return the latest object in that bucket with that key. So let's run this and see this in action. So let's run this again. So we have the get file overload. So if I switch over to our Amazon S3 bucket and refresh this again, so we can see all the latest versions. Now, if I make a call with the get object, it's going to return the current version. So if I put a breakpoint inside our get endpoint, so let's get the file object response and see the values in there. So let's call the get file along with the key. So let's say sample.json. So let's ignore the version ID and click execute. Now in this case, we have the file object, and if we expand that, you can see the version ID inside this. So if I scroll down, you can see there is a property which says version ID, and that has the value. So in this case, this has something that starts with TB and ends with IW. So if I switch over to Amazon S3, you can see that that is the latest version in our case. Now, we haven't passed any version ID, which was null, which is why it got latest version. So if I switch back and continue this execution, this file is going to be the one that we just uploaded. However, if I want a specific version, so let's say I want to get this specific version, I can copy that version ID and use it inside our API endpoint. So let's say execute in this case, and this time it's going to return that specific object. So if I scroll down, you can see the version ID right now is IF and ends with GF, which is what we just passed in. So let's continue the execution and let's download this file and see what the contents are. So let's say open, and here you can see this is the world updated, which was the previous version of this file. Now you can also list all the versions inside this endpoint if you want. So if I switch back to the code, let's add in a new endpoint here. So let's copy and paste this code. So let's say we have the whole get code copied, and let's put in a new endpoint. In this case, we are going to specify this as get file versions. So this is going to get all the file versions. So let's also rename this method. So let's specify this as get file versions. Now, instead of the get object async, we need to specify the list versions async method. So this is going to list all the versions of the objects inside that bucket. So let's fix this request. So let's specify this as new list versions request and pass in the bucket name and also the key. So let's remove that. Let's specify the key as a prefix. So let's specify the prefix and pass in the key. So this is going to use anything which has this key prefix and get all the versions of that object inside this bucket. Now, since we don't have an explicit file anymore, we'll have to update this return type as well. So let's remove this code and simply return a list of objects. So let's specify return file object versions, and let's map this property out. So let's map this as a new object. So let's specify a dot. So let's first specify the bucket name, the key name, the version ID, and let's also expose two of the properties, is latest and is delete marker, which we will see shortly. So let's return this and let's run this again to see this in action. So now we have the new endpoint, so get file versions. Let's say try it out. Let's specify the key as sample.json. Now we don't need the version ID on this endpoint, which we will remove. So let's click execute. And in this case, this is going to return 3 versions. So you can see we have the bucket name and the file name, which is the same, but we can see the different versions in these cases. So we have a version ID here, and we also one version ID, which is the null. Now, if you look at the isLatest marker, you can see only one of the object is the latest, and isDelete marker is false for all the objects currently. Now, if I go and delete one of these files, it is going to set a delete marker. Now, before we explore the delete marker, let's take a quick look on how S3 versioning is working. From a cost perspective, Amazon S3 rates apply for every version of the object. So if you have 3 versions of the object stored, you are charged for 3 objects. So it's pretty much simple in terms of costing and how it will affect your AWS bill. Now, if I scroll down, you can see here that every version of the object is created a new instance inside our bucket, which we already saw in action. So every object has a version ID, even if the S3 versioning is enabled or disabled. It's just that it will be set to null when the versioning is turned off. Now, when you enable S3 on a bucket, we saw that all existing objects are unchanged. Only new objects are getting affected, or the ones that is written on top of existing objects. So whenever you add a new file, it keeps the existing file and just writes a new file on top of it and makes that as the latest marker. We saw that marker attribute coming back in the list versions call. So this is why it's able to get the latest object whenever you pass in just the key of that file. Now, when you click at delete, what happens is it doesn't delete the actual file. It puts a new marker object there, which is the delete marker. Now, that object doesn't have any data of the object, but it just says it is a deleted object. So let's see that in action. So if I switch back to our API endpoint, let's go into our delete file and let's say try it out. Now, in this case, we can specify sample.json without any version ID, which means it's going to delete the latest file. Now, it's not going to actually delete it, but simply put a marker in the latest position. So let's go and click execute. And this is going to insert a delete marker. So if I switch back into Amazon S3 and refresh this, we can see that the object is no longer showing here. But if we turn on show versions, we can see that the sample.json has a delete marker against it. Now, this is simply a marker row that's inserted to tell that this object is deleted. So any call to the get is now going to return a null because that object is currently deleted. So if I go into our Swagger UI, let's go to get file and let's specify the sample.json without a version ID, which means it's going to try and get the latest version, and let's click execute. Now, in this case, this is going to return an exception because I haven't handled the case of a null object. So it says the specified key does not exist, which means we don't have the file inside Amazon S3. Now, however, if I have a specific version ID, so let's say if I copy this version ID and use that inside our method, so let's say the version ID and say execute, this is going to download that specific version. So now it has hit the breakpoint and you can see this is returning the object. So if I continue this execution, you can see there is the download file option. And if I open that, this will be the latest file because that's the latest version before we deleted that file. So now we see that there is a delete marker in this case. Now you can delete this file again. So if you go back into Amazon S3 and let's say we issue a new delete file request against the key. So if I click that and refresh this, we will see now we have 2 delete markers. So all it's doing is inserting a new record saying this has deleted. Now, if you want to delete a specific version, we need to specify the version ID as well. So until now, we haven't been specifying a version ID inside our delete calls. So if I switch back and copy this version ID of that delete marker record and paste this in here, this is going to delete that specific record from Amazon S3. So let's make sure to remove the unnecessary spaces and click execute. Now, if I come back and refresh, you can see one of those delete markers is removed, which means this object is still deleted because the topmost record and the current record is a delete marker. Now, if I upload a new object on top of this, that object is going to come back into life again. So let's switch over to VS Code. So in our sample.json, so let's say this is world recreated and let's upload that again into our UI. So let's go to the post endpoint and let's click try it out and choose the file and upload this again. Now in this case, what's going to happen is a new file is going to get inserted above our delete marker. So now if I was to delete this file, it's going to insert a new record again. So if I go to the get call and retrieve without any version, we have a current version which is latest that is not deleted. So we get back that object. Now, if I was to download this file, it's going to say world recreated. So you can see that that is the file that is currently the latest. Now, you can also explicitly delete an object without inserting the marker. So now in this case, if I explicitly copy this version and delete this, it is not going to insert a marker record. So if I remove that and paste in the latest version ID and let's say execute, this is going to delete this specific record. So if I refresh this, you can see that's gone and it's resetted to the delete marker, which means the file is deleted again. Now I can go and delete this file to restore it into the previous state. So if I delete that last delete marker, it is going to remove the delete marker and the file is going to be available again. So now if I remove the show versions, you can see the sample.json exists inside the bucket because we deleted the delete marker. Now, this can be a bit confusing when you start using it first, but all you need to understand is anytime you delete, it's not actually deleting the file, but just putting a marker record in the object bucket with the same key to indicate that file was removed. And if you take that marker record, it looks like the file was never deleted. So if you want to delete a specific record, you need to pass in the explicit versioning ID. Any other case, if you call a delete, it's just going to put a delete marker record. Now, once you start using it a couple of times, you will get the hang of it. Now, S3 versioning is a great way to retrieve back old or accidental deletes, but don't mistake this for AWS backup. Now, that's a completely different functionality which allows you to back up the storage and make it available if you accidentally delete the entire bucket or even force delete all these objects by passing in the explicit IDs. So it's always a good option to have both these options enabled depending on your application and the use cases you're using it for. Now, if you want to learn more about AWS backup and how to set that up, let me know in the comments below and I'll do a separate video on that. I hope this helped you to understand more about S3 versioning and start using it in your .NET application. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.